Hi, y'all. How's it going? You know what time it is? Woo! Get into it! See, I'm getting better at catching. See? Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Chris, and we are back with another reading of the Neverending story. We only have 2 chapters left after this chapter, so we're making good time, and then we're going to be switching it up. But I hope everybody's had a good day. Oh, okay. So, there is a small group of people in my social circle that knows that I love mythology. I love any type of mythology, like African, Hindu mythology, Chinese, Japanese, Greek, Roman, Celtic, Norse, Polynesian, Arthurian legend. I love myths because they are tales that inspire us, that give us broader perspectives on certain issues. And this Saturday is St. George's Day. Now, St. George is someone we will be reading on that day because I have St. George and the Dragon, which is a very famous Arthurian legend. And it is actually illustrated. And I wish she was still here on this earth. Trina Shart Hyman. She is one of my favorite illustrators of all time. And now I got a hardback cover of her work. And it's just gorgeous. It really is. It just reeks of fairy tale taste and magic. And she's written tons and tons of different books. Yeah. Oh, that halo around the book. I guess I have to put my hand behind the product. But she's just great. And I wish she was still here to illustrate more wonderful stories. Fun fact about Trina Shart Hyman is that she has 2 biracial grandchildren who she took the initiative because she realized that there were not a lot of stories written about black children in the world at the time that they were growing up. And she wrote stories using them as her main characters. And I will try my best to find those stories for you all so we can read them. Because representation does matter. A lot of people want to sit here and complain that, and I don't like this word, that we live in a woke culture. There's nothing viral or fancy about being well-rounded, and to acknowledge that, you know, the world isn't just one particular race or one particular community or one particular neighborhood. It's a whole melting pot of people. Black, brown, white, tall, short, young, old, able-bodied, and handy-capable, and people of different identities and genders. And it's a beautiful thing. Life is supposed to be filled with billions of different things. If everything were the same, life would be quite stale and we would never get anywhere. But this story is someone who goes against the grain, who puts his best foot forward, and just shows that no matter what the obstacles may be, you should always continue to fight. I've said this before, you know, life will throw you some curveballs that may knock you down, you know. Fall down 7 times, get up 8, because it's the getting back up that counts. You can get back up. So we will read that. I'll put this in a safe place, actually, because I'm going to be going to work out after this. We will read that for St. George's Day, and I'm super excited. It's one of my favorite stories. I remember, I didn't know who her name was, but I knew her art style by certain things I was reading as a child, and I had a lot of her books as a kid, ironically. I don't know if that was like a conscious choice on my parents' part or my aunties and uncles' part, but I just had a lot of her books around, so yes, awesomeness. So without further ado, we will begin. Oh, I need new glasses. Well, I don't really necessarily... I mean, I need new glasses because it's been at least 2 years since I've gotten my latest prescription. So I do need new glasses, but I love these frames. They just need to be tightened up. And I don't have the steady hands to do that. So if I have friends locally that know how to tighten up the ears of glasses, please message me. Appreciate you. And without further ado, again. So Bastien traveled the Sea of Mist, is now in a new part of Fantastica, trying to find his way back to the human world. But he only has so many wishes left. And if he loses them all, he could be stuck there and forget that he ever was human. So we'll see what happens next. Chapter 24. Dame Iola. Oh, hold on, turn the page. There we go. Zaida's end is soon told, but hard to understand and full of contradictions like many things in Fantastica. To this day, many scholars and historians are racking their brains for an explanation of what happened. While some deny the whole incident or try to interpret it out of existence, here we shall simply state the facts, leaving others to explain them as best they can. Excuse me. Just as Bastien was arriving at the town of Yaskal, Zaida and her black giants reached the spot where his metallic horse had collapsed under him. In that moment she suspected that she would never find him, and her suspicions became a certainty when she came to the earthen wall and saw Bastien's footprints on it. If he had reached the city of the old emperors, he was lost to her plans, regardless of whether he stayed there, whether he managed to escape. In the first case, he would become powerless like everyone else there, and no longer able to wish for anything. And in the second, all wishes for power and greatness would die within him. For her, Zaida, the game was over in either case. She commanded her armored giants to halt. Strangely, they did not obey, but marched on. She flew into a rage, jumped out of her litter, and ran after them with outstretched arms. The armored giants, foot soldiers, and riders alike ignored her commands, turned about, and trampled her with their feet and hooves. At length, when Zaida had breathed her last, the last column stopped, like run-down clockwork. When Hisbald, Hyadorn, and Hycurian arrived with what was left of the army, they saw what had happened. They were puzzled because they knew it was Zaida's will alone that had moved the hollow giants. So they thought it must have been her will that they should trample her to death. But knotting problems were not the knight's forte, so in the end, they shrugged their shoulders and let well enough alone. But what were they to do next? They talked it over and decided that the campaign was at an end, discharging the army and advised everyone to go home. They themselves, however, felt bound by the oath of fealty they sworn to Bastien and resolved to search all Fantastica for him. That was all well and good, but which way were they to go? They couldn't agree, so deciding that each would search separately, they parted and hobbled off, each in a different direction. All three had countless adventures, and Fantastica knows numerous accounts of their futile quest, but these are other stories which shall be told another time. For years the hollow black metal giants stood motionless on the heath not far from the city of the old emperors. Rain and snow fell on them. They rusted little by little, sank into the ground, some vertically, some at a slant, but to this day a few of them can be seen. The place is thought to be cursed, and travelers make a wide circle around it. But let's get back to Bastien. While following the winding path through the rose garden, he saw something that amazed him, because in all his wanderings in Fantastica, he had never seen anything like it. It was a pointing hand carved from wood. Beside it was written, "To the House of Change." Without haste, Bastien took the direction indicated. He breathed the fragrance of the innumerable roses and felt more and more cheerful, as though looking forward to a pleasant surprise. At length he came to a straight avenue, bordered by round trees laden with red-cheeked apples. At the end of the avenue a house appeared. As he approached it, Bastien decided it was the funniest house he had ever seen. Under a tall pointed roof that looked rather like a stocking cap, the house itself suggested a giant pumpkin. The walls were covered with large protuberances, one might have said bellies, that gave the house a comfortably inviting look. There were a few windows and a front door, but they seemed crooked as though a clumsy child had cut them out. On his way to the house, Bastien saw that it was slowly but steadily changing. A small bump appeared on the right side and gradually took the shape of a dormer window. At the same time, a window on the left side closed and little by little disappeared. A chimney grew out of the roof, and a small balcony and a balustrade appeared over the front door. Bastian stopped still and watched the changes with surprise and amusement. Now he understood why the place was called the House of Change. As he stood there, he heard a warm, pleasant voice, a woman singing inside. 100 summers to a day we have waited here for you. Seeing that you have found the way, it most certainly must be you. Your hunger and your thirst to still, all is here in readiness. You shall eat and drink your fill, sheltered in our tenderness. Regardless whether good or bad, you've suffered much and traveled far. Take comfort for the trials you've had. We'll have you just the way you are. I want that over my door for my first house. Ah, thought Bastian, what a lovely voice. If only that song were meant for me. The voice began again to sing. Great Lord, I pray, be small again. Be a child and come right in. Don't keep standing at the door. You are welcome here and more. Everything for many a year has been ready for you here. Bastian felt irresistibly drawn by that voice. He felt sure the singer must be a friendly person. He knocked at the door, and then the voice called out. Come in, dear boy. He opened the door and saw a small but comfortable room. The sun was streaming in through the windows, and in the middle of the room there was a round table covered with bowls and baskets full of all sorts of fruits unknown to Bastian. At the table sat a woman as round and red-cheeked and healthy-looking as an apple. Bastian was almost overpowered by a desire to run to her with outstretched arms and cry, Mama! Mama! But he controlled himself. His mamma was dead and was certainly not here in Fantastica. This woman, it was true, had the same sweet smile, the same trustworthy look, but between her and his mother there was a little resemblance. His mother had been small, and this woman was large and imposing. She was wearing a broad hat covered with fruits and flowers, and her dress was of some sort of bright flowered material. It was some time before Bastian realized that it consisted of leaves, flowers, and fruits. As he stood looking at her, he was overcome by a feeling that he had not known for a long time. He could not remember when and where. He knew only that he had sometimes felt that way when he was little. Sit down, dear boy, said the woman, motioning him to a chair. You must be hungry. Do have a bite to eat. I beg your pardon, said Bastian. You're expecting a guest. I've really come here by accident. Really? Said the woman with a smile. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. You can have a bite to eat all the same. Meanwhile, I'll tell you a little story. Go on, don't stand on ceremony. Bastian took off his black mantle and laid it on a chair and hesitantly reached for a fruit. Before biting into it, he asked, What about you? Aren't you eating, or don't you care for fruit? The woman laughed heartily. Bastian didn't know why. Very well, she said after composing herself. If you insist, I'll have something to keep you company, but in my own way. Don't be frightened. With that, she picked up a watering can that was on the floor beside her and held it over her head and sprinkled it on herself. Oh, she said, that is refreshing. Now it was Bastian's turn to laugh, and he bit into the fruit and instantly realized he had never eaten anything so good. You like it? Asked the woman, watching him closely. Bastian couldn't answer because his mouth was full. He chewed and nodded. I'm glad, the woman said. I've taken a lot of pains with that fruit. Eat as much as you please. Bastian took a third fruit, and that was a sheer delight. He sighed with well-being. And now I'll tell you the story, said the woman. But don't let it stop you from eating. Bastian found it hard to listen, for each new fruit gave him a more rapturous sensation than the last. A long, long time ago, the flowery woman began, our childlike empress was deathly ill, for she needed a new name, and only a human could give her one. But humans had stopped coming to Fantastica. No one knew why. And if she had died, that would be the end of Fantastica. Then one day, or rather one night, a human came after all. It was a little boy, and he gave the childlike empress the name of Moonchild. She recovered, and in token of her gratitude, she promised the boy that all his wishes in her empire would come true. until he found out what he really and truly wanted. Then the little boy made a long journey from one wish to the next, and each one came true, and each fulfillment led to a new wish. There were not only good wishes, but bad ones as well. But the childlike empress drew no distinction. In her eyes, all things in her empire were equally good and important. In the end, the ivory tower was destroyed, and she did nothing to prevent it. But with every wish fulfillment, the little boy lost a part of his memory of the world he had come from. He didn't really mind, for he had given up wanting to go back, so he kept on wishing, but by then he had spent all his memories, and without memories it is not possible to wish. So he had almost ceased to be a human, and had almost become a fantastican. He still didn't know what he really and truly wanted. It seemed possible that his very last memories would be used up before he found out. And after that happened, he would never be able to return to his own world. Then at last he came to the House of Change, and there he would stay until he found out what he really and truly wanted. You see, it's called the House of Change, not only because it changes itself, but also because it changes anyone who lives in it. And that was very important to the little boy, because up until then, he had always wanted to be someone other than he was, and he didn't want to change. At this point, she broke off because her visitor had stopped chewing and was staring open-mouthed. "If that one doesn't taste good," she said with concern, "just put it down and take another." What? Bastian stammered. "Oh, no, it's delicious." "Then everything's fine," said the woman. "But I forgot to tell you the name of the little boy, who had been expected so long at the House of Change. Many in Fantastica called him simply the Savior, others the Knight of the Seven-Armed Candelabrum, or the Great Knower, or Lord and Master, but his real name was Bastian Balthazar Bux." The woman turned to Bastian with a smile. He swallowed once or twice and said very softly, "That's my name." "Well then," said the woman, who didn't seem the least surprised. Suddenly the buds on her hat and dress burst into bloom. "But," said Bastian hesitantly, "I haven't been in Fantastica 100 years. "Oh, we've been waiting for you much longer than that," said the woman. "My grandmother and my grandmother's grandmother waited for you. You see, now someone is telling you a story that is new, even though it's about the remotest past." Bastian remembered Gregorman's words that had been at the beginning of his journey, and now suddenly it seemed to him that 100 years had indeed elapsed since then. "But by the way, I haven't introduced myself. I'm Dame Iola," which, fun fact, kids, dame is a term that refers to an older woman of respect. So in France, you would say, for a young lady, you would say mademoiselle, or for an older woman in France, you would say madame. In America, you would say, like Mrs. or Miss or mother such and such. Don't ever say, like, if somebody's a widow, don't ever be like the widow Jenkins. Like, that's a very antiquated way of addressing someone of older authority as a female. Like, don't do it. And God forbid if I have someone to marry, like, don't call me the widow Sains. Like, that's, no, don't do that. Like, there's, like, for males, there's, Lord Johnson or something, or Mr. Johnson, or, like, for those who are knighted in England, which is a thing, like, there's Sir Ian McKellen, there's Sir Elton John, there's Dame Maggie Smith, or Dame Judi Dench. You know, there's plenty of people who have titles of authority that, within reasonable means, we should all respect in our own ways. Everybody, I think, or would want to believe, has somebody in their family that is a person of authority. For me, on my mother's side of the family, I would say that would be my mother's mother, my grandma Catherine. She, to me, is worthy of being a madame, a lady. My father's side of the family, people of authority would be my granddad, Pete Herbert. I would call him Lord Sains or Sir Sains or just Granddad because he was an awesome person. And then my grandmother, Annie Ruth, I would just call her Mrs. Sains. Yeah, that's what I would call them. Now, enough of that and back to the story. Bastian repeated the name several times before he was able to pronounce it properly. Then he took another fruit, he bit into it, and as usual thought the one he was eating was the most delicious of all. But then he noticed with some alarm that there was only one left. "Do you want more?" asked Dame Viola, who had caught his glance. When Bastian nodded, she plucked fruit from her hat and dress until the bowl was full again. "Does the fruit grow on your hat?" Bastian asked in amazement. "Hat? What are you talking about?" cried Dame Viola. But then she understood and broke into a loud, hearty laugh. "So you think it's a hat I've got on my head? Not at all, dear boy. It all grows out of me, just as your hair grows out of you, that I should show you how glad I am that you finally come. That's why I'm flowering, bearing fruit. If I were sad, I'd wither. But come now, don't forget to eat." Bastian was embarrassed. "I don't know," he said. "Is it all right to eat something that comes out of somebody?" "Why not?" asked Dame Viola. "Babies drink milk that comes out of their mothers. There's nothing better." "That's true," said Bastian with a slight blush, "but only when they're very little." "In that case," said Dame Viola, beaming, "you'll just have to get to be very little again, my dear boy." Bastian took another fruit and bit into it. Dame Viola was delighted and bloomed more than ever. After a short silence, she said, "I think it would like us to move into the next room. I believe they may have arranged something for you." "Who?" Bastian asked, looking around. "The House of Change," said Dame Viola, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. And indeed a strange thing had happened. The living room had changed without Bastian noticing that anything was going on. The ceiling had moved upward while 3 of the walls had come close to the table. There was still room on the 4th side where there was a door, which now stood open. Dame Viola arose, and then he saw how big she was. "We'd better go," she suggested. "It's very stubborn. Opposition is useless if it has thought up a surprise. We may as well let it have its way. It usually means well." Bastian followed her through the door, but took the fruit bowl with him as a precaution. He found himself in a large dining room that looked somehow familiar, only the furniture seemed strange. The table, and especially the chairs, were so large that he couldn't possibly have sat in them. "Fancy that," said Dame Viola with a chuckle. "The House of Change is always thinking up something new. Now, for your benefit, has provided a room, and it must look to a small child." "You mean," said Bastian, "that this room wasn't here before?" "Of course not. The House of Change is very wide awake, you see. This is its way of taking part in our conversation, and I think it's trying to tell you something." She sat down in one of the chairs at the table, while Bastian tried in vain to climb up on the other. Dame Viola had to pick him up and put him on it, but even then his nose was barely level with the tabletop. He was glad he had taken the bowl of fruit and kept it on his lap. If it had been on the table, it might have been beyond his reach. "Do you often have to change rooms this way?" he asked. "Not often," said Dame Viola. "Never more than 3 or 4 times a day. Sometimes the House of Change will have its little jokes, and then the rooms are suddenly reversed. The floor on top and the ceiling at the bottom. That sort of thing. But it's only been bumptious, and it stops when I give it a piece of my mind. All in all, excuse me, it's a well-behaved house, and I feel very comfortable in it. We have good laughs together." "But it isn't dangerous?" Bastian asked. "For instance, if you're asleep at night and the room gets smaller and smaller." "What nonsense, dear boy!" cried Dame Viola, pretending to be angry. "It's very fond of me, and it's very fond of you too. It's glad to have you here." "What if it takes a dislike to someone?" "No idea," she replied. "What questions you asked! There's never been anyone here but you and me." "Oh," said Bastian. "Then I'm your first guest?" "Of course!" Bastian looked around the enormous room. "This room doesn't seem to go with the house. It didn't look so big from outside." "The house of change," said Dame Viola, "is bigger inside than out." Meanwhile, night was falling, and it was growing darker and darker in the room. Bastien leaned back in his big chair and propped his head on his hands. He felt deliciously sleepy. "Why," he asked, "did you wait so long for me?" "Dame Viola." Somebody's talking about me because I didn't do that on purpose, y'all. "I always wanted a child," she said. "A child I could spoil, who needed my tenderness. A child I could care for. Someone like you, my darling boy." Bastien yawned. He felt irresistibly lulled by her sweet voice. "But," he objected, "you said your mother and grandmother waited for me." Dame Iola's face was now in the darkness. "Yes," he heard her say. "My mother and my grandmother also wanted a child. They never had one, but I have one now." Bastien's eyes closed. He barely managed to ask, "How can that be? Your mother had you when you were little, and your grandmother had your mother." "No, my darling boy," said the voice hardly above a whisper. "With us it's different. We don't die, and we're not born. We're always the same, Dame Iola, and then again we're not. When my mother grew old, she withered. All her leaves fell, and as the leaves fall from a tree in the winter, she withdrew into herself. And so she remained for a long time. But then one day she put forth young leaves, buds, blossoms, and finally fruit. And that's how I came into being, for I was the new Dame Iola. And it was just the same with my grandmother when she brought my mother into the world. We Dames Iolas can only have a child if we wither first, and then when our own child, and we can't be a mother any more. That's why I'm so glad you're here, my darling boy." Bastien spoke no more. He had slipped into a sweet half-sleep in which he heard her words as a kind of chant. He heard her stand up and cross the room and bend over him. She stroked his hair and kissed him on the forehead. Then he felt her pick him up and carry him out of her arms. He buried his head in her bosom like a baby. Deeper and deeper he sank into the warm, sleepy darkness. He felt that he was being undressed and put into a soft, sweet-smelling bed, and that he heard her lovely voice singing far in the distance. "Sleep, my darling, good night. Your sufferings are past. Good Lord, be a little child at last. Sleep, my darling, sleep tight." I just made that up on the spot, so bear with me. When he woke up it's here on the page, but the melody I made up on the spot. When he woke up in the next morning, he felt better and happier than he ever had before. He looked around and saw that he was in a cozy little room, lying in a crib. Actually, it was a very large crib, or rather as large as a crib must look to a baby. For a moment this struck him as ridiculous, because he certainly wasn't a baby anymore. He was still in possession of all the powers and gifts that Fantastica had given him. The childlike Empress's amulet was still hanging from his neck, but in the next moment he stopped caring whether it was ridiculous or not. No one but him and Dame Iola would ever find out, and they both knew that everything was just as it should be. He got up, washed, dressed, and left the room. A flight of wooden steps took him to the big dining room, which he had turned into a kitchen overnight. Dame Iola had breakfast all ready for him. She, too, was in high spirits. Her flowers were in full bloom. She sang and laughed and even danced around the kitchen table with him. After breakfast, she sent him outside to get some fresh air. In the great rose garden around the House of Change, it was summer, a summer that seemed eternal. Bastien sauntered about, watched the bees feasting on the flowers, listened to the birds that were singing in every rose bush, playing with the lizards, which were so tame that they crawled up on his hand, and with the hares, which let him stroke them. Hares, bunnies, little bunnies. From time to time he crept under a bush, smelled the sweet scent of the roses, blinked up at the sun, and thinking of nothing in particular, let the time glide by like a brook. Days became weeks. He paid no attention. Dame Iola was merry, and Bastien surrendered himself to her motherly care and tenderness. She seemed to him that without knowing it he had long hungered for something which was now being given him in abundance, and he just couldn't get enough of it. He spent whole days rummaging through the House of Change from attic to cellar. He never got bored because the rooms were always changing, and there was always something new to discover. Clearly the house was at pains to entertain its guests. It produced playrooms, railway trains, puppet theaters, jungle gyms. There was even a big merry-go-round. or else he would explore the surrounding country, but he would never went too far from the House of Change, for suddenly he would be overcome by a craving for Dame Iola's fruit. When that happened, he could hardly wait to get back to her and eat his fill. In the evening they had long talks. He told her all about his adventures in Fantastica, about Perilyn and Gregorman, about Zaida and Atreyu, whom he had wounded so cruelly and perhaps even killed. "I did everything wrong," he said. "I misunderstood everything. Moonchild gave me so much, and all I did with it was harm. Harm to myself and harm to Fantastica." Dame Iola gave him a long look. "No," she said, "I don't believe so. You went the way of wishes, and that is never straight. You went the long way around, but that was your way. And do you know why? Because you are one of those who can't go back until they have found the fountain from which springs the water of life, and that is the most secret place in Fantastica. There is no simple way of getting there." After a short silence, she added, "But every way that leads there is the right one." Suddenly Bastien began to cry. He didn't know why. He felt as if a knot in his heart had come open and dissolved into tears. He sobbed and couldn't stop. Dame Iola took him on her lap and stroked him. He buried his face in the flowers of her bosom and wept until he was too tired to weep any more. That evening they talked no more. But next day Bastien brought up the subject again. "Do you know where I can find the water of life?" "On the borders of Fantastica." "I thought Fantastica had no borders." "It has, though. Only they're not outside, but inside, in the place where the childlike Empress gets all her power from, but where she herself cannot go." Seeing what she's getting at? Because he's wearing... Put the two together. Got it. "How am I to find the way there?" asked Bastien. "Isn't it too late?" "There's only one wish that can take you there. Your last." Bastien was terrified. "Dame Iola, all the wishes that have come true thanks to Orin have made me forget something. Will it be the same with this one?" She nodded slowly. "But if I don't notice it, did you notice it other times? Once you've forgotten something, you don't know you ever had it." "What am I forgetting now?" "I'll tell you at the proper time. If I told you now, you'd hold on to it." "Must I lose everything?" "Nothing is lost," she said. "Everything is transformed." "But then," said Bastien in alarm, "I ought to hurry. I shouldn't be staying here." Ooh, excuse me. She stroked his hair. "Don't worry. It will take time, but when your last wish is awakened, you'll know it. And so will I." From that day on, her something began indeed to change, though Bastien himself noticed nothing at first. The transforming power of the House of Change was taking effect, but like all true transformations, it was slow and gentle as the growth of a plant. The days of the House of Change passed, and it was still summer. Bastien still enjoyed letting Dame Iola spoil him like a child. Her fruit still tasted as delicious to him as at the start, but little by little his craving had been stilled. He ate less than before, Dame Iola noticed, though she never mentioned it. He also felt that he had had his fill of her care and tenderness, and as his needs for them dwindled, a longing of a different kind made itself felt, a desire that he had never felt before, and that was different in every way from his previous wishes. The longing to be capable of loving. With surprise and dismay, he recognized that he could not love, and the wish became stronger and stronger. One evening, as they were sitting together, he spoke of it to Dame Iola. After listening to him, she said nothing for a long while. She looked at Bastien with an expression that puzzled him. "Now you have found your last wish," she said finally. "What you really and truly want is to love." "But why can't I, Dame Iola?" "You won't be able to until you have drunk of the water of life," she said. "And you can't go back to your own world unless you take some of it back for others." Bastien was bewildered. "But what about you?" he asked. "Haven't you drunk of it?" "No," said Dame Iola. "It's different from me. I only need someone to whom I could give my access." "But isn't that love?" Dame Iola pondered a while, then she said, "It was the effect of your wish." "Can't Fantasticans love? Are they like me?" he asked anxiously. She answered, "There are some few creatures in Fantastica, so I'm told, who get to drink of the water of life, but no one knows who they are, and there is a prophecy, which we seldom speak of, that sometime in the distant future humans will bring love to Fantastica. Then the two worlds will be one, but what that means, I don't know." "Damiola," Bastian asked, "you promised that when the right moment came you'd tell me what I had to forget to find my last wish. Has the time come?" She nodded. "You had to forget your father and mother. Now you have nothing left but your name." Bastian pondered. "Father and mother," he said slowly, but the words had lost all meaning for him. He had forgotten. "What must I do now?" he asked. "You must leave me. Your time in the House of Change is over." "Where must I go?" "Your last wish will guide you. Don't lose it." "Should I go now?" "No, it's late. Tomorrow at daybreak you have one more night in the House of Change. Now we must go to bed." Bastian stood up and went over to her. Only then, only when he was close to her, did he notice that all her flowers had faded. "Don't let it worry you," she said, "and don't worry about tomorrow morning. Go your way. Everything is just as it should be. Good night, my darling boy." "Good night, Damiola," Bastian murmured. Then he went up to his room. When he came down the next day he saw that Damiola was still in the same place. All her leaves, flowers, and fruits had fallen from her. Her eyes were closed, and she looked like a black dead tree. For a long time he stood there gazing at her. Then suddenly a door opened. Before going out he turned around once again and said, without knowing whether he was speaking to Damiola or to the house, or both, "Thank you. Thank you for everything." Then he went out through the door. Winter had come overnight. The snow lay knee-deep, and nothing remained of the flowering rose garden but bare black thorn bushes. Not a breeze stirred. It was bitter cold and very still. Bastian wanted to go back into the house for his mantle, but the doors and windows had vanished. It had closed itself all up all around. Shivering, he started on his way. And that is where we will end for tonight. The Neverending Story. I love this story, y'all. It's a full gambit. It's the true hero story. And I enjoy reading it to you all. Peace, love, and hair grease, y'all. I'll see y'all later.